We've actually changed our mind.
I'm fine. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so if everybody's ready. This House believes that Israel should extend voting rights in national elections to all Jews everywhere. First, we'd like to provide a model for this round. This House is Israel. In terms of voting rights, we're seeking voting rights that people can exercise as an optional choice. They're not being forced to vote. You don't have to be Jewish to vote. You would register to vote by going to the embassy. They check your, just to make sure you're Jewish, with a background check, and so forth. The opposition's position today is the status quo. The first argument, we'd like to present three arguments in today's debate. The first is that Israel is unique in history. The second is that we'd like to present an argument relating to Israeli demographics, and the third is about Arab demographics. And then why both of these present the need to allow Jewish citizens, Jewish people everywhere to vote in Israeli elections. First is that Israel is unique in history. It's a beleaguered country. It's in a siege mentality. Technically, it's still at war with some states, such as Saudi Arabia. Arabs throughout the Arab world are hostile to Israel. Iran is developing nuclear weapons. Hezbollah, Hamas launch attacks and rockets into Israel. So really, if you live in Israel, you are living in a state where you're surrounded with hostile intentions. And this clearly changes your worldview. No, thank you, not right now. The reason this matters is because the way you can break this siege mentality, allow for more discourse, allow for more dialogue, allow for more opinion in Israel, is to allow everybody who has an interest in the state, all Jews, to give them to have a voice in the elections. No, thank you, none of you. And to prevent a slightly more detached view into the election, a less heated, a less emotional view, a more rational view that in the long run can lead to a peaceful solution in the Middle East. So in this sense, you can see that's good for Israel. And as an example of emotional reactions after terrorist attacks, where I live in New York City, after 9/11, we saw America pass the Patriot Act. That was a pretty bad bill. Similarly, if we had a slightly less emotional reaction to these attacks, a slightly more rational reaction, we wouldn't have had such bad bills passed. Thank you, not right now. The second is that's good for the individual, because you can still express solidarity with the Jewish state, while at the same time acknowledging your identity as, say, a Jew and an American in New York. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Isn't that actually a problem? Because if people only view Israel in terms of its foreign policy, like which foreign Jews will do, that would prevent any domestic policy from being considered Israeli American.
However, the problem with that point of view is that we need to look in terms of priorities for the Israeli state today. Israel suffers from an existential threat. This threat won't go away. It's the first thing you need to deal with. It's the most important thing that Jewish people, no thank you, worldwide can help Israel with. That's the priority. Now, the second argument that we'd like to go into today is about the growth in the Israeli population. The majority of growth in Israel today is driven by hardline Orthodox Jews. The reason this matters is because they are the ones who are they're the ones who settle, they're the ones who are the most radical, they're the ones who claim greater Israel, and they're the ones who make dialogue impossible. With them, you cannot have a peaceful solution in the Middle East as long as the radical extremists are the ones that continue to hold the most sway. The way you prevent this, no thank you, is by allowing and encouraging more moderate voices into the discussion. For example, in Israel, to demonstrate the influence of these extremists, when they had to remove settlers from the Gaza Strip, they had used thousands of Israeli troops to do it, and that was only for a few settlers within Gaza. The more these grow, the more intractable these problems become. And furthermore, another problem is that the Israeli army is slowly growing more and more radical as well. So instead of being a neutral tool of the state, no, thank you, it's actually becoming more and more radicalized. Now, the problem is that not only is this, and lastly, the problem is that this assaults the basic notion of Israel as a secular Jewish state. So, for example, in Israel recently, the Orthodox community ruled that streets in a certain neighborhood had to be sex segregated, somewhere for men, somewhere for women. This blatantly undermines the notion of Israel as a secular state. So it's a theoretical assault on Israel's foundations. It's also a long-term threat because they prevent dialogue. Now, lastly, and Jews worldwide aren't so conservative and quite so hardline, which is why they provide this antidote. Lastly, about the growth in Arab demographics. Even though the Orthodox Jews are the most quickly growing population in the Israeli Jewish community, Arabs are actually growing the quickest within Israel as a whole and within Palestine. The reason this matters is because one of the central tenets of Israel is that they're democratic, Jew other Jews to vote, you have a double bind, in the sense that either Israel can remain Jewish and become an apartheid state and deny the right to vote to all these Palestinians and to all these Arabs, or it can remain democratic, but then it's no longer a Jewish state. It doesn't fulfill its central role as a representative of the Jewish people. What this means is that it's the only way you can allow Israel to remain democratic. The only way they can also allow it to remain Jewish and maintain its character is by permitting Jews worldwide the right to vote. Thank you.
Before I get into that, I want to talk about how inside opposition today, we have a fundamental problem with the notion of Jews and Judaism as a monolithic world entity, right? We don't think that's how it is, and we actually think that that's going to be incredibly harmful for Jews everywhere. That's going to be my first argument. Then I want to talk about the notion of democratic process and why this undermines democracy in Israel. So on this first question of Jews and Judaism as a monolith, we think that Jews around the world will not want to be identified as belonging to Israel for several reasons. First of all, they have their own national identities, right? You know, Americans are very patriotic. They define themselves as Americans. We don't think that they would be all that comfortable with being defined as part of a Jewish state somehow, even though they've never lived there in their lives. But what we would also say about this is that the notion of Jews as a monolith creates a situation where the rest of the world identifies these people from other places with the conflicts in that region, where the people from all around the world say, look, Jews in America, Jews in Britain, Jews in France, they're all implicated in what we see as Israel's failings, right? We have a real problem with that. We think that's actually going to lead to more anti-Semitism, right? Because we know that people don't rationally connect when they think about Israel. They don't rationally connect, oh, you know, these people were killed in the Gaza Strip. That means the Jews are bad, right? There's no necessary rationale there. But what you have is a situation where the people from all of these countries are now drawn into that conflict. They now own that conflict. They now own Israel's failings. And what we think is that not only would they not want to be identified with Israel's failings in Gaza, Israel's failings with the Palestinians, but that this will actually lead to more resentment of Jews and Judaism as a religion, as a people, right? We think that is actually going to create a bigger existential threat than the one identified by First Prop today, yes.
But in today's world, aren't Jews identified with Israel anyway?
No. Okay, I'm going to carry on. I don't think that's really the fact at all, because right now, people define themselves according to their nationality, right? You define yourself as an American, as a Canadian, whatever. Religion is part of that's part of your image too, but it's not a part of it shouldn't be a part of the way that other people view you. It shouldn't be a way that people can connect you with the failures of the state. We have a real problem with that on side First Opposition today. But I want to get into the nitty-gritty of this resolution now about democracy in Israel, because we heard some arguments from First Prop saying that, oh, well, this is, the growth of Arabs in Israel, is going to drown out the Jewish voice, and that its fundamental role is as a Jewish state. What we would say is that the people who are voting from America, from outside Israel, they're going to be voting on purely foreign policy, right? They have no vested interest in the domestic policy of their Jewish state, right? And although it is a Jewish state, it still has millions of people that live there, that work there, that are affected by its laws. So if we allow this kind of incredible influence from all around the world, what you have is a situation where the actual citizens of Israel are totally drowned out. The citizens of Israel have very little control. And what that will do is change the political process. It'll change the political process in such a way that elections are conducted purely based on discussions of foreign policy. Discourse on domestic issues will be drowned out altogether. Because obviously there's a huge block of Jews to be appealed to in America, right? So if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, you're not going to talk about, national daycare or whatever relevant issues there are to Israel as a state domestically. You're going to talk about what you're going to do with settlements. You're going to talk about what you're going to do in the Gaza Strip. You're going to talk about what you're going to do with the Palestinians. That is all that's important to you now as a political leader. And we have a real problem with the elimination of domestic political discourse in these countries. connected with the state failing, where they're unfairly associated with the problems that Israel has around it. We think that's harmful for Jews everywhere and for Israel. They also talked about this more rational political discussion, right? And just mathematically, we have to quibble with this, right? They said that there's extremists in Israel. Well, think of this in terms of standard deviation, right? There's extremists everywhere. They're at the fringes of the society. Doesn't matter where you draw your votes from, they're still going to be out there, so that doesn't stand. They talked about, finally, this existential threat that Israel faces. We would say that for the reasons I've talked about, for the reasons of how this undermines democracy in Israel and how this can create more anti-Semitism by linking Jews with the state, that this actually creates a bigger existential threat. That's why we stand on opposition.
All right, I thank Mark and call on Israel.
If they just vote on the basis of foreign policy, we already say it undermines the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that, but like we actually don't think that, firstly, people living in other countries, like they are capable of thinking outside the box. They are capable of realizing that foreign policy is not the only thing that they can involve in all this. And second of all, we do think that foreign policy is like a really, really big like deal in Israel. We do think it's something that needs to be dealt with first. So basically, yeah, to go on now to the things that the opposition have said. Well, basically they tell us, okay, we don't want Jewish people to be more connected to Israel than they already are, because, but we think, okay, first of all, Jewish people are already like very connected to Israel. We think like already in the world they are like the opposition may And lastly, this idea that Jews are everywhere and they're going to like pop up no matter where you get, like no matter where you take a vote from. I think that obviously they're going to exist more in a country that has like a history of people trying to attack them, like terrorists trying to attack them there, except for like not the people who are living outside of the country. Seeing the news from a different perspective, seeing the news from a perspective that doesn't have anything to do with the countries, and they can just sort of step back and be like actually consider the situation properly. So basically, like we've told you why Israel is like unique as a state. We've told you why they're different, why they need this policy. We've told you how this will actually lead to more like benefits for Israel. How it will actually lead to better politics there. How it will actually benefit Jews living outside of Israel and for the Israel people.
All right, thank you, Ed.
Alright, I'm going to go right into it. I've got one constructive point that's kind of a mix of two. We've got the idea that this is unfair to Palestinians that already exist within the Jewish state, and that the idea of how this is going to shape how Israel is viewed by the world. I'm going to go on to the proposed and rebut all of them. Let me begin. We've got to look at the idea of how this is unfair to Palestinians, because what this bill will do is we will make Palestinians into an even bigger minority, and the claim that they are underrepresented in the Jewish state, that their views aren't considered by the Jewish state and by the Jewish government, is going to become an even more ingrained view. And that this has a bunch of bad impacts that I'm going to talk about. But this whole idea that Palestinians are underrepresented is going to now gain ground. It's going to gain traction. And the huge Jewish voting bloc that you have is going to crowd out the Palestinian minority. I'm going to tell you why that's a problem. But the side government seems to like consider that like, oh, Jews are kind of at risk of not being a minority anymore because of this Arab demographic. That's just ridiculous in the first place. So like the demographic isn't shifting at a rate that is going to make Jews ever a minority in their own country. That's just ridiculous. So since there's a massive majority of Jews, the whole responsibility of democracy is to consider the views of everyone. And yes, it has responsibility to Jewish people, but it also has responsibility to Palestinian people. It has responsibility to Palestinian people for a bunch of reasons, but it's also like we have this practical view on side off that this is going to increase that peace process. Now, the way people view Israel is Israel based on this making Palestinians a huge minority is part of this. Because people will now negatively view Israel because they're not giving any space for the Palestinian consideration in their government. They're creating this massive majority of Jews that will only be considered as foreign policy concerns, and the domestic concerns of Palestinians that have a vested interest in the state of Israel, arguably a greater vested interest in the state of Israel than those Jews living outside of the country, are now going to not be part of the democratic, are like not going to be as big a part of the democratic process. Their voices will not be heard, and this is bad for the optics argument. The idea that how will people view this? It will be viewed negatively on the state of Israel and inhibit the peace process because people, Hamas, for example, or take any type of extremist Islamic organization, they're going to view Israelis as sort of like oppressing the Palestinian minority and like preventing them from having their views heard. So that gives Hamas traction. That gives other oppressive sort of Islamic institutions a sort of voice, and it actually gives them traction so that they can oppose the state of Israel. And it's going to sort of promote these sort of extremist type of solutions that we see as a big problem with the current fragile state of peace in the state. And also, we've got the idea that it undermines Israel's view of itself as a bastion of democracy if it can't provide for its own citizens, if it can't provide for its Palestinian minority. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, actually, I was going to ask about your Hamas point in the view of Israel. Isn't Israel already viewed as oppressive? And furthermore, interestingly... Yeah,
but okay, that doesn't, even if it is viewed as oppressive, it doesn't mean that we should encourage this view any more than it already is. Like, that doesn't make any sense. That's like zero argument. Like, the whole idea is, like, we don't want to encourage this, like, predominant view that Israel is oppressing its minority of people. Like, Hamas will use that as traction for, like, its extremist attacks. Why the hell would we want to, like, encourage that? So it's like the equivalent of Quebec saying that the French should vote in its elections, and that's going to undermine the Anglophones in the state, in the province of Quebec, in a similar way that you're undermining the interests of the Palestinians in the state of Israel. So here's what side opposition told you. They told you that Israel is unique in its history. It's kind of interesting. They conceded that the existential threat defines Israel, but they say that we need Israelis who aren't like connected with the existential threat to have any sort of like view in the government, because that will create the moderate solutions to the peace process. That's contradictory. But first, they talked about this unique history, that Arabs are hostile, and the less heated and rational view will lead to peace. And then they also talked about the Israeli and Arab demographic. Now, I already deal with this, this idea in my constructive that if Palestinians are made into an even bigger minority, this is just going to give traction to the extremist solutions that Hamas is promoting. When it comes to demographics, and the idea that Orthodox Jews run the show, it's like the status quo is better than the people of Israel that are only considered with its foreign policy running the country. The domestic concerns of Israelis are the most important thing, and the government decides what its priorities are. You sit down. Side government sort of argue that the priority of Israel is this existential threat. We argue on side opposition. The priority of the Israeli state is what its people say the priority of the Israeli state is. They are not this existential threat just because they assert that that's the problem. And they talked about this Arab population growth, yada yada, that's ridiculous. Israelis are the Jews are always going to be a majority in the Jewish state, and obviously the massive majority of the people in the United States want foreign policy. So what I'm going to talk to you about today? Talk to you about how this is unfair to Palestinians and how it's bad for the optics of how Israel is viewed by the rest of the world. It's going to give traction to extremism. It's going to not promote any of this type of constructive solutions we want. And for these reasons, we beg to vote. Thank you.
Material, financial, soldiers, everything to create this state, defend ourselves. We needed financial support to develop this wealthy and growing, bountiful society. We needed their cultural expertise to make this a liberal democracy. We needed their bodies to maintain this state as a majority Jewish state. We do not need to worry about the minority of Palestinians. The Palestinians are worried about the majority. The Palestinians living in Israel will be destroyed if Israel is destroyed. For their quality of life, for their very corporal existence, they need our state to exist and be as strong as it can be. We need all to support us. Yes.
Fundamentally, this is my argument. I wasn't arguing that Hamas would care about the nitty-gritty of the Israeli constitution. The problem is that they will take this idea that Palestinians have no voice in this country anymore, and that they're domestically very vested in the state of Israel, and they'll throw it at the state of Israel and use it as a terrible, terrible precedent.
You know what? In Gaza, do Palestinians have a voice in their government that they do not have in our constitutional democracy? Why do we get these anti-Israeli sentiments brewing inside our very assembly? Israel exists for one reason, to preserve the Jewish race. We are Quebec. Quebec does not exist to preserve French culture. Quebec exists to be Quebecers. Israel exists as a refuge, as a political support and bastion of our culture from a millennia of oppression and from whatever the future will throw at us. We must survive until the Messiah comes.
You care so much about the state of Israel. Don't you care about the domestic goings-on of this dear, dear state and this wonderful, wonderful...
We heard this debate in the first round, and indeed we do have some domestic problems here in Israel. But I am sure our member of the assembly here did his service in the IDA and defended our country and all of that. And he knows that our number one priority here in Israel, because of our exceptional status, is survival. People who have a simple choice, who have an opposition which does not support the Israeli state's existence, which does not support our purpose here and everything that we have put in.
Obligations in Israel, like serving in the army.
The side proposition today for Rock is that the fundamental uniqueness of being an Israeli, a Jewish citizen of the state of Israel, is that these people grow up knowing that they will have to risk their lives to defend their state. They grow up knowing that at any moment, as they quite rightly pointed out, a barrage of rockets, or even, God forbid, a nuclear attack could come from another country and they could be annihilated. I'll take you in a second. They grew up knowing that there is Damocles hanging over their head that threatens their existence every day on a very basic physical level. And the fact is, Jews living in other countries, no matter how much they identify with the state of Israel, don't have that same dilemma, don't have that
Apart from not suffering from the same siege mentality, why would somebody vote in Israeli elections if they weren't invested in Israel's survival and the existence of the state?
What I would say is no matter how much they feel inside, intellectually or emotionally, that they're invested in survival, they cannot compare to people who raise their children knowing that their children are killed. Any comparison of those two things is inherently ridiculous. And the idea of army service, never mind the tax edition, which applies to every country, is very essential to the national ethos of being an Israeli Jew. Every Israeli Jew, male or female, is expected to serve in the army at some point, besides certain specific exemptions. Furthermore, many jobs in Israel are only actually open, officially or unofficially, to people who have served in the army. Certain benefits of citizenship in Israel are only open to people who have served in the army. Non-members of minorities who haven't. That is how central army service is to the Israeli national ethos and to Israeli citizenship. We say that somebody else outside the country can never feel that citizenship, can never feel that national ethos, and therefore has no right to vote in its election and determine its policy. So now there are a few arguments we heard from side opposition. So very briefly, I could spend an hour doing this, but I'll have to do it in about a minute and a half. We look at the first argument, which is that Israel is unique. Well, yes, we agree. Israel is unique. Israel has a siege mentality. Yes, we agree. Israel has a siege mentality. But that itself just incorporates itself into the extension I just proposed and shows why only people living in the state of Israel and enduring its laws and its conflicts, so thank you, have a right to vote in the election. Then we saw this very interesting point about demographics. Now, there are a whole series of things that were wrong with this point. But let me just briefly say that side proposition is mistaken when they think that having foreign Jews encountered in the voting roll will actually make the country more left-wing and more moderate. The fact of the matter is that the reason why Israel doesn't just annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza today is because they're worried about Arab demographics. If on their voting list, now all the Jews in the world can vote in Israeli elections, that actually mitigates or completely eliminates that problem, no thank you, to a very serious degree. If we allow all the Jews in the world to vote in Israeli elections and contribute to the voting pool, Israel has far less of a disincentive to simply annex the West Bank and East Jerusalem and even Gaza in order to add to their territory that they feel is rightfully theirs. And their extension, well, once again, the fact that it's under threat and that it exists to protect the Jewish people just plays into our extension. So because side proposition today has violated the basic Israeli social contract and national ethos, without any way of getting around it, we say that this resolution must.
It is with honor that I address the Knesset on this day after its So, what side opposition talked about in our extension is what he really said was that Israel and Jews are tied together, and that's what we absolutely believe. They're tied together like two mittens, like so you can't lose them. And why? It's because one mitten without another mitten is useless. Fundamentally boils down to the fact that Jews and Israels are inextricably tied together. And now we're going to look at this debate from several contexts. We're going to look at it from the point of the survival of the Jews, and we're going to look at it from the survival of Israel. Because as it's already been addressed by the government, Israel is an exceptional country, and no other country on earth has an experience like or even remotely close to Israel's. And also that Israel's threat is Israel's very existence is under constant threat. Yes, I'll take the point.
Yeah, sure, they're like 2 minutes, except 1 minute is not serving the Israeli National Army, and 1 minute is.
well, if the one mitten was serving in the Israeli National Army, then it would be the same mitten. So let's talk about survival. What do I mean by survival? When I say survival, as the member of the office we talked about, again, we're all Jews, and we have this, he sort of pointed to the fact of our Jewishness, which refers to our culture, and he points to the fact that we have a sort of a military threat, and there's anti-Semitism, so it's a threat of existence and of violence. So, in essence, that's what this House really has to decide today, is whether the survival of Jews and the survival of Israel really hinges on voting rights. And I think that's what really the second half of the opposition got to in their extension. And so when we talk about the survival of the Jews, and I thank you, when we talk about the survival of the Jews, we have to look at culturally. So to be Jewish isn't just a religion, it's also a cultural aspect. So we have all sorts of religious sites in Israel that are important to the Jewish cultural heritage. And in fact, that having them preserved and maintained by Israel is very, very important. So, in essence, Jews have a sort of stake in Israel as well. Even if you don't live in Israel, the members opposite of the Knesset, it's very easy because we're all Jews living in Israel, but Jews outside of Israel think very differently from us. And so there is sort of this cultural heritage that Israel does have to defend, and has to defend on behalf of all Jews. And so the survival of Jewish culture is facilitated by Israel. And so Jews have a strong tie to Israel in that sense, and they're sort of vested in Israel. And we believe that because Jews are so tied into Israel like no other country, that they actually should have these unique voting rights. Israel was founded on the fact that Jews need a homeland, that Jews need a refuge, that our culture needs to be preserved after so many years of being under attack. So that's why, in essence, Jews need to vote. And as the member back of the opposition, or of the government, the opposition a couple times, the government. Remember the backup of the government was talking about is Israel also needs Jews to have the right to vote. And again, on survival grounds, it's because Jews contribute to Israel militarily, they contribute to financially, as the second half of the government mentioned. And it's also because Jews as well spend a lot of political capital too, like there's lobbying efforts. And so Israel does have a stake in the Jews and vice versa. And in both of these stakes, though, survival is of the utmost importance. It's like, how do I describe it? It's kind of like those fish that like one sucks on the other and then the other eats like the pieces that fall off. It's a codependent relationship. And that's why it's so unique. That's why the voting rights have to be given to Jews in this case. And so the other thing the second half of the government also mentioned was, we talk about anti-Semitism, like Hamas hates you anyways, and Jews everywhere are like subject to anti-Semitism. And so when we also talk about that we're tied together, we have to bear in mind that Israel's actions can facilitate more anti-Semitism. So Israel's actions can actually affect Jews outside of Israel. And that's why Jews outside of Israel actually should have a stake in what Israel does. And then one last reputation, the members opposite talks about Israeli foreign policy and versus Israeli domestic policy, and that Jews outside outside of Israel would only vote based on foreign policy, right? Because they don't live in Israel, they don't really care about domestic policy. Again, Israel is such a unique country. If you're under daily threat of attack, like the sword of Damocles is here, and you're like Jews living in Israel, then like that is going to be your most important like voting condition. Like Jews in Israel, like foreign policy is already their most important voting condition. We have people who voted Labour, which is like a socialist party, who then went on to vote like Likud. Even though they have completely different social policies, like Jews in Israel like will vote based on which party they feel will actually defend them best as a state. So, and we don't criticize these Jews for not caring about domestic policy. So it's for all these reasons, because they're extremely tied to Jews.
on our part of the social contract, which we don't feel was adequately refuted. Now, in this whip speech today, I'm going to firstly deal specifically with the extension, or two extensions really, that we heard come out of side proposition, and then sum up this debate in two key themes. So let's look at the first extension. Now, essentially, what the first extension of side proposition added to this debate was the notion that Israel and Jews are linked together. Thank you for your valuable addition. Now, the second extension, which I'm sure was what their extension was supposed to be, was that if a state's actions harm you, you gain the right to vote. To which we could question America's actions harms not only foreign Americans' perception, but really people all over the whole world. But we don't give everyone the right to vote in America just because they're affected by America's actions. We feel that's quite ridiculous. So having dealt with both extensions by both different members, I'll get into the two key questions of this debate. Firstly, what is Israel? And secondly, who is best for Israel? So firstly, let's ask, what is Israel? And essentially what the proposition brought forward was this idea that it's a country with a unique history. But what we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is just because it has this unique history does not mean the very basic fundamentals of any society, the social contract, do not apply to it. What we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that Israel has evolved from a concept to a state. The concept may have been responsible to all Jewish citizens, all Jewish people, but what the state is responsible to is its own citizens. And that's what we support today on side of opposition. Essentially what we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that the Jewish state has to stay tied to its historical concept. And that's what we say has changed. Now that it's a sovereign state, ladies and gentlemen, it's its citizens who need to be listened to. And then we heard from the second half, this idea that it's a bastion of Jewish people. Now what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is that are those people who choose to sign into different social contracts people who should run policy? Essentially what they're proposing, ladies and gentlemen, is a very different concept of citizenship itself. In fact, it's kind of like citizenship a la carte. You can choose whichever aspects of countries you want and gain benefits from various different ones. We say, ladies and gentlemen, you can't expect to sign into the social contracts of different countries and expect benefits from every one of them. You stay tied into one, ladies and gentlemen, and get benefits from that one. That's what we support today on side opposition. So then we get to the question on who is best for Israel. And there are two main things. We heard from the first half, this idea that Jews from outside of Israel benefit Israel. And from secondly, we saw that Jews being mobilized from everywhere. This idea that the second half talked about is good for Israel. I'm going to deal with both of those in turn. So firstly, this idea that outside Jews are good for them. And there were two reasons why they are. Firstly, because they're rational, and secondly, because they're not affected by siege mentality. Let's get into each one of those in turn. Now, firstly, we reject this baseline assumption that just because Jews live outside of Israel, they're necessarily going to be rational and clear-headed on issues involving that region. We absolutely oppose it. Like the second opposition themselves said, these are people who are often heavily invested in the survival of Israel, and as a result, don't necessarily have to be rational about the whole process. And moreover, what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, to their idea that these people aren't affected by siege mentality, is that the fact is in Israel, siege mentality is a reality. And we feel that because of that, ladies and gentlemen, people who haven't grown up in a culture that encourages things like the army, we would feel that they should be making national decisions because they haven't been affected at all by national circumstance. Yes?
Like, just because they don't live in, because they live in this country, because they have siege mentality, do you think they're able to make a rational decision?
See, firstly, we've already told you that just because they live outside of it doesn't mean they make rational decisions. And secondly, your idea of rationality here is really flawed. The fact is, we give countries the right to make the decisions based on their own national circumstance, regardless of what a third party like certain opposition considers rational. That's what we support today on side opposition. And lastly, we had this idea from the second opposition that what we need to see is really Jews being mobilized everywhere. We need financial support. We need military support. Despite the fact that no plan on side proposition actually called for Jews voting to actually join the army. The only mobilization you're going to see is people flying in and out on planes to vote. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. And the finance they're talking about, the financial support, intrinsically comes anyway, regardless of their bill. Side opposition has successfully shown to you today that Israel might have a unique history, but it's still rooted in the same social contract that defines every sovereign state. That people who are affected by national circumstance are the ones who make national decisions. And because not all Jews protect Israel, ladies and gentlemen, Israel has no such obligation to protect all Jews. And on those grounds,